Happy Monday, everybody. So this is probably going to end up being two parts, both because I think YouTube has limits on what you can upload when you're not a well-subscribed user, but also it's just a lot of content to digest. So I'd like to take some time and talk a little bit about HEX history, like project history, and also address kind of my thinking about the project and how it relates to the recent brouhaha over possible ETH recycling by Origin or Flush Address. Yeah, let's start with history. I'm gonna try not to dive all the way deep, so bear with me. I'm a bit of a verbose person, and the history is long. So I've been contributing to the project in one way or another for about a year. I think my Telegram join date was sometime in February of 2019. And I went through the website and the docs and the public GitHub at that time and worked on a simulator in a different programming language that basically took all the rules as encoded in the contract and then built some simulation capability on top of it to say such and such Bitcoin claim rate, stake rates, etc. Like what happens, what comes out the other side. And that's really how I got started in the community. I documented everything I was learning in the layman's guide and just kept that up to date as the code changed. And then also just went out of my way to answer questions from community members. Through that process, I earned trust of Richard and several other kind of prominent community members, and basically became involved in a lot of the design process for the rules as they exist today. So way back then, there were a couple of pretty significant differences than the system that went to production. So one, there was no adoption amplifier. It was just Bitcoin claims. There was no big payday. That was called We Are All Satoshi. This was the marketing name. And what became big payday, all the unclaimed coins, was paid out in daily increments, similar to what the adoption amplifier became. So instead of 500 million coins going to the adoption amplifier every day, 500 million coins would be added to the day's interest pool, sort of over the course of the launch phase. So the idea was you get people excited about doing free Bitcoin claims, and then early people stake their coins and earn their share of 500 million coins a day, so through the first year. And there were a bunch of problems. There were some logic problems, and the thing kind of fell apart. Like there was a compounding issue where short stakes would beat long stakes. There was just really no way around the fact that you have your lowest adoption at the beginning, so they were getting more chunks of 500 million than anybody who came later. So there was this kind of insurmountable advantage. It was just a cliff where people who got in day one vastly outperformed people who got in day two, vastly outperformed day three, etc. And for months, literally for months, me and Richard and Greg Martin, to some extent, and the lead dev, all kind of just thought about this problem and proposed solutions and built models. I think Richard used this process to become quite a spreadsheet ninja. He was already kind of more natively thinking in terms of spreadsheets, and he produced a very complex spreadsheet to sort of project effects of doing this thing or that thing. Explored a bunch of alternatives to shares. Shares weren't quite the same as they exist today. For example, Greg had a really good idea about the share price back then. It was structured differently, but we did end up with a model similar to that, similar to his original proposal that basically used share price to do compounding. So we had a bunch of experiments with explicit compounding where you'd have to call a function to compound. It was a nightmare. And through it all, the purpose of telling you this is that through it all, every model had to pass a couple of tests. First, all the commitments made on the website had to be true. So shorter stakes always had to lose to longer stakes. It was bound by inflation. What else? That you would get kind of your fair share, that it compounded, because there was a promise of the compounding early on. Oh, it was weekly. It wasn't even daily at the start. It was weekly periods, not daily. So converted to daily, you had to compound. You had to always win with longer stakes. You had to have the ability to earn more if you were one of the few stakers rather than having many, many stakers. But also, something that I think needs to be said is that the systems that Greg originally proposed, and also another system called net asset value, or NAV, was proposed and worked out in the models, had a downside, and that is that they maintained this property that day one people crushed the ROI of day two people and day three people and day four people. So it was not smooth. It was still this cliff that if you were the first person to hear about it, you got all the money, or all the HEX. And that was a non-starter. I mean, Richard was very clear from sort of throughout that this needs to be a process that gives everyone a chance to capture value, so that there's not this you're first to hear about it effect, where then you kind of have runaway gains over everybody else. So he and I think Greg dropped out at some point. Greg, I think, was very uncomfortable with the adoption amplifier sort of from the jump, and he has a life and he's busy. He's got other things to do than think about this. So a lot of the back and forth at some point became mostly me and Richard, and there were a couple other folks who I think are not still active, so I won't name them with their Telegram handles. And we worked through a ton. I probably ran 50 experiments of different ways of smoothing out the ROI curve. And what we finally came to, or rather I pitched a few times, and finally got adopted, was Big Payday. So there was really, to my mind, no way of getting around this issue of the fact that you're issuing 500 million coins a day into the interest pool. There is almost nothing you could do to smooth out the curve. I tried tons of stuff. Again, okay, I'm not going to dive too deep on that. I tried tons of stuff to make that work. But finally, I think I was able to convince Richard that we had to change the mechanism for paying out the unclaimed coins. And so that became Big Payday. Share price, what we ended up on for share price was also, I had taken what Greg had done and changed it slightly, because one thing he didn't account for was the bonuses, and I fixed it to account for bonuses. Then the main dev found a bug in that model and actually made it much more elegant in his implementation. But the share price mechanism today, what came out of that, those discussions. So again, I think I want people to know that behind the scenes, this was important. It was very important that people be able to make ROI, whether you heard about it day one or day 300. And whether you got involved or just sat on the sidelines, you wanted to see how it did. By day 340 out of 350, you could still make decent ROI. And Big Payday had a lot to do with that. Doing the share price the way that I recommended, where you do the change on exit, so rather than daily, automatically, it's only when stakes end. There's a bunch of stuff that we designed together, though ultimately it's not my project, it's Richard's project. He made the calls on what to do, but the motivation was always there to make the on-ramp for folks not too daunting, and you don't have to feel like you missed out just because you came in 6 months late or you didn't hear about it for 9 months. And I proved that out in a whole bunch of simulations and posted the data at the time, saying that, yeah, I mean, you might make 2x if you're day one versus day 300, but just 2, not 1,000 or 10,000x, over that person in terms of your HEX holdings. So there was that. So that's important to know going into it. And I think we'll go with that for part one. So to summarize, the adoption amplifier wasn't always in. The Big Payday mechanism was not always in. Share price was not always in. These things all came out of well-intentioned discussions and designs to have a smooth adoption curve in terms of sort of relative holdings. Getting in earlier is better, but not astoundingly better than getting in late. It was the whole goal. And we achieved it through a lot of experimentation and running simulations. I had a simulator, the main dev had a simulator, Paul of HEX wrote a simulator. We all collaborated to make sure we had the rules consistent so that we could sanity check each other. So my model would actually model individuals doing stuff. Paul did kind of stuff in aggregates, and we spotted issues kind of through this cross-checking thing. It was really a community effort to make sure that the thing we built was going to do what was intended. You know, the analogy that I used is you do a lot of prep before you launch a rocket to take pictures of Saturn, because you can do very little to course correct once that rocket leaves the atmosphere. And HEX is like that. The point was the code had to be locked down, and so we had to really explore all the edges, all the edge cases, all the weird stuff that could happen. So we're going to stick with that. That is sort of design and motivation to get the system that we have. So I'll talk about the adoption amplifier in the next video a little bit, and then also the history of the origin address and flush address.